Chapter 2, The Impact of Technology. New production methods, new materials. Mass production is the focusing upon a manufacturing project of the principles of power, accuracy, economy, system, continuity, and speed. While one phase of modern design was defined by its socio-cultural role within the expanding picture of consumption and the newly defined marketplace, an area of modern life which could not be easily rationalized and systemized. Its other important defining context was the much more rationally based world of mass manufacturing and technological innovation. Indeed, the story of expanded consumption and market demand cannot, on its own, account for the development of a concept of modern design. It was also defined by its key role within the manufacture of large numbers of standardized goods, which were produced to meet expanding market demand, but which, because of the high investment costs needed to produce them in large numbers, had to be sold aggressively. Design crossed the technology-culture divide as a process which was intrinsic to mass manufacturing, as well as a phenomena which communicated socio-cultural values. It was embedded equally as firmly within the worlds of consumption and production. Indeed, it was one of the key forces which helped to link those two worlds together and make a seamless connection between them. In addition to understanding design's role within the socio-cultural context of consumption, it is also important to appreciate its position within the story of technological change as it affected, and was affected by, manufacturing and the world of materials. Technological innovation underpinned the manufacture of the vast number of newly conceived products that came into being from the late 19th century onwards. They challenged and excited designers' imaginations, as well as constituting a whole new area of material culture which complemented the more traditional area of decorative arts. The wide availability of such novel goods as vacuum cleaners and electrical appliances and new modes of transportation, as well as the new forms of advertising and retail display which were developed in these years, provided the means through which both existing and new consumers could create new identities for themselves and negotiate their entry into modern life. The modern concept of design and the process that underpinned it superseded the traditional decorative arts and the craft process that had generated them as a direct result of the development of the division of labour within industrial manufacturing. This new means of producing goods caused the work of the traditional artisans to become fragmented into a number of new, differentiated tasks. The advent of mass consumer culture also required that new commercial tasks were undertaken by designers who had a unique perspective on the market. As a result, designing emerged as a new activity, or rather as a new combination of activities. In response to the social transformations that industrialization brought with it, and the ensuing need for material culture to carry new social culture meanings, designing combined a new set of activities which crossed the production/consumption divide. Consequently, it was uniquely placed to represent the notion of modernity as it related to both arenas. Industrialization was one of the key defining features of the modern world. In Britain, the discovery of steam power inspired the invention of numerous new machine tools and production techniques. In turn, these new tools facilitated the manufacture of new consumer machines, new materials, cast iron among them. The result of the work of the steam pump were responsible for dramatic changes in the design of products and of the environment, making people new kinds of architecture and product decoration. These discoveries transformed the production of the traditional decorative arts. In textile production, for example, the spinning jenny and the jackwood loom revolutionized the way in which textiles were both conceived and made, and caused the designer, unlike craft weavers, who had been able to make decisions as they went along, to have to make aesthetic choices in advance of manufacture. The need to make decisions earlier represented an important paradigm shift from the working process of the artisan, who had depended upon tactic skills, to that of a designer for industry, who had to undertake more self-conscious, rational planning. This was echoed in many 19th century industries, among the fabric printing, where a mechanical roller was used, and in ceramic production, which make an increasing use of moulds. In the 19th century, this divided labour process created a multitude of new art workers, whose jobs involved translating the ideas of fine artists into mass-manufactured goods. While Britain transformed the manufacturing methods of the decorative art industries, creating large numbers of goods for the new consumers, The USA made huge advances in the efficient organization of labor and production in the new technologically oriented industries, in the development of highly specialized machine tools, and in the manufacture of new goods with a technological bias. Much has been written about what dubbed the American system of manufacture. H.J. Habakkuk, what the fuck? People have such strange names. For example, has described the differences between the developments in Britain and the USA, showing that mechanization was much more advanced in the latter because, given the greater availability of farming land in that country, many labour was in short supply. Siegfried Gideon's seminal text, Mechanization Takes Command of 1948, focused on the theme of the importance of the machine to American culture and to the country's preeminence in modern functional design. Indeed, modernism, the prevailing design philosophy of the mid-20th century, considered the machine, with its links with function and rationality, to be the key metaphor and source of aesthetic inspiration for modern design. David A. Hounshaw's study of America's technological progress, published in 1984, focused on the fundamental continuities within the story of American manufacturing in this period. He outlined a story which began with the changes that took place in American arms production in the 19th century and moved through to automobile manufacturing in the 1920s. His narrative took in clocks, sewing machines, bicycles, agricultural machinery, and automobiles along the way. Hounshaw maintained that each industry learnt from the one before it, and that continuity existed in the use of steel as a basic material, in the development of standardized components, and in the use of specialist machine tools. By Henry Ford's time, Hounshaw argued, with the production of the Model T, pure mass production had been achieved. It was, however, in his view, only to last 12 years, as flexible mass production, spearheaded by Alfred P. Sloan at General Motors, superseded Ford's ideal of completely standardized manufacture. Sloan's impure model, Hounshaw argued, could be explained as a response to the demand of the market, which, for social-cultural reasons, required product differentiation. Hounshaw's text concluded, in fact, just at the point when the designer, in the form of Harley Earl at General Motors, who was followed by others performing similar roles appointed by other manufacturing companies, was catapulted into industry to create the level of differentiation. By the 1920s, Hounshaw argued, the existence of a second-hand car market, the urbanization of the mass of the American population, and the importance to the consumer of buying a second car which was not black and which was more impressive than his or her neighbour's equivalent, meant that while pure standardization was a technological possibility, it was not a commercial reality. Hounshaw emphasized an important moment in the early part of the story of modern design, the one in which technology and culture came directly into conflict with each other. In the event culture won the day, and design provided the means by which the two forces could achieve a new harmony with each other. In essence, from that point onwards, the products of new mass production industries became as sensitive as the decorative arts had long been to non-technological issues, such as stylistic and fashion change. In addition, the role of the visualizer became highly valued by industries, which acknowledged that they were forced to accommodate an element of art within their otherwise highly efficient, rational operations. While shifts within mass manufacturing created a gap which was filled by design, other areas of technological innovation helped transform the nature and appearance of the modern environment, as well as providing new challenges for the designer. The impact of plate glass windows on the cityscape, for example, mentioned in the previous chapter, was matched by the presence of other new materials, such as cast and wrought iron and concrete, which also helped to articulate the language of modernity to inhabitants of the modern material world. Architects and designers are keen to exploit the symbolic potential of the new materials in order to create a visual and material modernity. In Vienna, for example, the architect Otto Wagner was quick to use the new material aluminium in two of his projects. As a design historian Judy Atfield explained, cultural historians and critics have tended to present analysis of representations of material culture rather than its actual materiality, which, she argued, is experienced in a way that is difficult to discuss. Oh my god, so she said nothing, basically. In an exploration of the cultural impact of materials, designers have inevitably played a key role as they have created the world that people, however tactically, have encountered and come to understand. The architects and designers associated with the Art Nouveau movement, who sought to create a new style with no historical baggage attached to it, inevitably looked to new materials as a means of achieving this ambition. As Helen Clifford and Eric Turner explained, metal architecture stood for modernism. Cast iron was employed by Art Nouveau designers and architects for its practical qualities and aesthetic possibilities. Cast iron was particularly suitable for the expression of the suppleness and tensile strength of the Art Nouveau whiplash curve. Blending together the achievements of the engineers with a new language of modern decoration, the Art Nouveau designers self-consciously created an aesthetic modernity with the help of new materials which had not yet acquired any cultural baggage. While technology made new materials available, it could not on its own ensure either their application or their acceptance in the marketplace. Designers played a key role in gauging popular tastes and aspirations, and in transforming new materials into desirable goods. That was sometimes a respectively easy task, as in the case of celluloid, which, because it could be used as a substitute for more expensive, highly desirable materials, including jet, ebony, coral, amber and ivory, found immediate acceptance. Aluminium provided much more challenging to designers. Indeed, it wasn't until the turn of the century, when that new metal could be produced cheaply and had begun to replace enamel and brass as materials for cooking pots, that it was able to play a substitute role, although even then it was regarded with some suspicion. Only in the interwar years where designers were able to create a new aluminium aesthetic and visualize aluminium products as modern objects in their own right. This sense of a new material modernity was, inevitably, most visible in the public sphere in these years. Within the more traditional context of domesticity, there was, however, also a growing level of acceptance. The gradual absorbance of new materials into the home occurred through the acceptance in the early century, for example, of items made of pressed glass, a replacement for a more expensive cut crystal, and others made of the new plastic, bakelite, which was used for electrical accessories such as plugs and switches. A number of other materials that had traditionally been used within the domestic sphere found themselves used in new ways in order to create a sense of modernity. In the USA, for example, the renewed use of chintz in interior furnishing came into fashion in the early 20th century, replacing the earlier heavy velvets and brocade, and ushering in a new feeling of lightness which was perceived as decidedly modern. Although the home was slower than the public arena to rise to the challenge of new technologies in this period, the effects of gas and electricity were transforming both the public and the domestic spheres. By the late 19th century, the flavour of rationality which pervaded the factory and the office also began to permeate the home. A search for rationalism and increased efficiency underpinned factory practice in the last years of the 19th and the early years of the 20th century. In the factory and the office, this had been achieved through the application of Taylorism, and by the increasing modifications made to what has been called the American system of manufacture. The production of standardized interchangeable parts combined with the moving assembly line. The system was demonstrated at its most refined at Henry Ford's Highland Park factory, where the Model T automobile was first manufactured in 1913. The thinking that led to the use of the moving assembly line and the use of standardized parts was reflected in the design of the automobile, visually characterized by the multiplicity of its components which failed to add up to a unified whole. In spite of its overtly engineered rather than designed aesthetic, the Model T had strong consumer appeal, as it was marketed at first-time buyers whose preoccupations were of low price and reliability, qualities which Ford was able to provide. Mere ownership was, in itself, a mark of social distinction for the members of the rural population at whom the car was targeted and who, up until that time, had had to make do with horses. Oh, I'd love to have a horse instead of a car. As Hounshaw has shown us, however, it was a marketing strategy which had a limited life. as the product wasn't able to continue to stimulate desire once it was no longer a question of first-time ownership and competition had entered the marketplace. Taylorism, a scientific measuring system which analysed ways in which tasks were carried out and which suggests more efficient time-saving alternatives, was in evidence in the office and the factory, imposing a strong ethos of rationalism in the workplace. The desire for rationality in this context as a means of enhancing productive efficiency was transferred from the factory and the office into the domestic arena a few years later. The impetus to rationalise housework was also an extension of the tradition of household advice, which has begun with the writings of Catherine Beecher and her sister Harriet Beecher Stowe back in 1869. In order to demonstrate that a history of women's labour could be documented as fully as that of male labour in this public workplace, Ruth Cohen, and Susan Strasser, among others, emphasised the importance of the concept of the so-called labour-saving home of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and set out to show that, as it is not clear what the home is meant to produce, the concept of efficient production was ultimately less relevant in the domestic context than in the factory, with much productive work, preserving fruit, sewing clothes, etc., having been transferred to the factory. They both explain. The emphasis in housework had moved to nurturing and consuming rather than producing. In this new context, the introduction of efficiency into the household was a more complex proposition with a less obvious purpose. As in the factory, reorganisation preceded mechanisation in the implementation of efficient practice in the home. Christine Frederick's book of 1913, which had been serialised a little earlier in the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, outlined the ways in which tasks could be simplified by a reorganisation of the elements in the kitchen in order to reduce the number of steps that were needed to prepare a meal. The professionalisation of the housewife by giving her a white gown in emulation of a laboratory technician, and the repositioning of food preparation tools in emulation of an artisan's workplace. In essence, this attempt to bring rationality into the feminine sphere, hitherto perceived as an arena dominated by emotional values and consumer desire, meant a transformation of the existing elements of the home rather than the introduction into it of new, technologically innovative domestic tools. Through the absorption of her ideas into modernist kitchen planning and design, the impact of Frederick's work was greatest in the years after the First World War. In the years before 1914 in the USA, it was paralleled by another movement known as home economics. Like Frederick, Ellen H. Richard was a prime mover, aiming to make housework more efficient by focusing on the elimination of germs and sanitation, and to gain more respect for housewives. Both home economics and Frederick's ideas were formulated in the context of what had been called the servant problem. The shortage of servants for middle-class household, which resulted in housewives having to undertake their own housework. The same phenomena was also in evidence in Europe, although unlike the USA, where it had been taken up by the servantless middle classes. In Germany, for example, it was part of a programme of paternalistic social reform directed at the wives of working men. The promotion of a culture of rational planning entered the home through architectural thinking. Although in the pre-war years the labour-saving concept had only in the first instant envisaged a reorganisation of simple traditional tools, it nonetheless encouraged manufacturers to approach housewives as a rational being for the first time, and stimulated consumers to think in terms of rational consumption. It also put housewives in the right frame of mind to accept the new domestic tools, electrically powered ones in particular, when they became available in the marketplace by the end of the first decade of the 20th century. Indeed, when the newly formed electrical companies, General Electric and Westinghouse in particular, and the smaller domestic appliance manufacturers, Hoover and Sunbeam among them, set out to produce and market their new products, they were quick to develop a marketing strategy that stressed the importance to the housewife of using the new appliances as a means both of professionalising her role and of making her life easier. Producers of aluminium pans, for example, set up experimental kitchens in department stores where home economics experts demonstrated the benefits of using their products, thereby preparing the housewife to accept such goods rather than to reject them out of hand, as might have been the case if she had still assisted from the servants. If she still had assistance from the servants. One historian had suggested that they were also purchased by women who had been lucky enough to retain their servants as a means of encouraging them to stay. Although their beneficial properties represented an entry into modernity for the progressive housewife, prior to 1914, the small household tools that were manufactured and sold, toasters, electric frying pans, electric chafing dishes, and food heaters among them, were presented as crude, engineered mechanical devices rather than as tamed, visually attractive domestic goods. Like the Model T, they sold on the basis of their use value, and their novelty and ownership alone were sufficient to suggest the social status of their consumers. The distinction between invention and design was very clear. While the inventor's role was to create new applications for available technologies, the designer acted as the interface between these applications, manufacturing industry and consumers. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, new concepts followed new concepts, such that the consumer machines we are all now so familiar with, the sewing machine, the telephone, the refrigerator, the bicycle, and the automobile, were all born in this fruitful period, in which everything seemed possible. The greatest quantity of new products was conceived in the USA. In Europe, given the abundance of manual labour, the push to create new machines was less energetic. Once invented, these new goods had to be manufactured and sold in the open marketplace, and it was the designer's task to ensure that they could be made at an affordable price, but, perhaps more importantly, to render them both meaningful and desirable. Gradually, the new products began to be visually and symbolically aligned with the environments for which they were destined. Kitchen-based items, restricted to use by the servant or housewife, for example, usually retained a crude mechanical appearance, whereas other objects, such as Hoover's Model O electric suction sweeper, which boasted an Art Nouveau pattern on its metal housing, were given a more sophisticated appearance, destined as they were to be seen through the house. Toasters intended for the breakfast table frequently had decoration applied to their surfaces. Thus were technological inventions transformed into meaningful objects of desire, their technical and utilitarian features having been joined by others, which stressed their role as aesthetic and symbolic artifacts with a social-cultural function. So they made stuff look nice, basically, is what she said. This much writing to just say they made things look nice. Can you believe it? She must have picked the... Anyway, I've had enough complaining. By the First World War, the material landscapes in both the public and the private spheres had been transformed by a wide range of new goods, which were the result of the technological inventiveness and manufacturing capability of the era. Their presence engendered a strong belief in the power of science and reason to transform the world for the better, a key ideological feature of early 20th century modernity. This belief existed alongside the irrationality of conspicuous consumption. Increasingly, advertisers and marketing men had to engage with rational arguments in order to be able to sell many of their goods, especially those destined for the kitchen. But the appeal of what was seen as accessible luxuries continued to play a strong role within the psychology of consumption, defined as a process within manufacturing and as a seductive tool of the advertiser whose task was to appeal to the eye and the heart as well as to the head. Design flourished in this new modern ambience. The materials of modernity. Base metals were transformed into marvels of beauty, expressive of our own age. Throughout the 20th century, the discovery of new materials and innovations in production technologies constantly challenged designers to find forms and meanings for them. Ever keen to augment their profits, manufacturers increasingly sought less expensive ways of creating their goods and, wherever possible, substituted traditional materials which had been used for craft manufacture with new, cheaper ones, suitable for mass production. This technological and economic drive forward was necessarily mediated by consumer acceptance, but aggressive sales techniques employing advertising and design were harnessed as a means of creating desire and emphasizing the modern appeal of the materials in question. Design acted as an important bridge between technology and culture, anticipating consumer demand and making new technologies and materials both available and desirable to the mass market. The 19th and early 20th centuries had seen iron and steel transform the environment, while plate glass had brought an unprecedented level of spectacle into the urban streets. In the hands of the lady interior decorators, chintz had moved from the country to become a sine qua non of the stylish interior, replacing the heavier velvets and the brocades of the Victorian parlour. Abstract ideas about form, developed by fine artists conscious of the new visual nature of the environment they inhabited, had inspired change, and the democratization of modernity had encouraged a new look for the materials of everyday life. Indeed, it could be argued that new materials made everything feel and look different, thereby creating their own visual and tactile modernity. The desire to invent new materials played a significant part in the thrill of technological innovation. Indeed, at no time was the urge to create new substances as strong as it was in the 19th century, and the materials of mid-20th century modernity owed their existence to a number of key individuals who had been active in those years, as well as to a considerable amount of capital investment. Two key materials of interwar modernity, plastics and aluminium, why do I keep saying it like that? Aluminium, were discovered in the middle of the 19th century. Plastics were developed as a substitute for more expensive substances such as amber, jet and jade, which were in short supply. But aluminium was a material that did not have an application at the time of its invention, and was therefore dubbed a solution without a problem. While the developments of these two materials were parallel in many ways, they also diverged significantly. By the 1930s, however, they had both come to be perceived by designers and consumers alike as modern materials par excellence, imbued equally with something which could not ultimately be described, maybe, but which was tactically understood as representing modern life. The French cultural critic Roland Barthes, I don't know how you say, Barthes, came nearest to explaining why plastics had a charismatic presence for consumers of modern material culture when he wrote, some years later, that plastic is the stuff of alchemy. Plastics and aluminum have both been considered by historians as important agents of cultural change. In his book, Pioneer Plastic, The Making and Sale of Celluloid, Robert Friedel demonstrated the way in which this early semi-synthetic material succeeded in establishing itself through its links with the early film industry, as well as through its application to products such as billiard balls and its ability to make novelty goods such as hat pins and letter openers available to a wide audience for the first time. Plastics have received more attention than aluminium, partly because of their innumerable applications and partly because they are more immediately recognizable to the public at large, which is an understanding and appreciation, even if sometimes negative, of their impact. Throughout the history of their application, plastics have been linked with certain products. Celluloid, the first plastic, is known as the material of billiard balls and cinematic film, while bakelite is the material of electrical fittings and 1930s radio cabinets. The most far-reaching account of plastics history and its link with modernity has been provided by Jeffrey Michael. How would you say this name? Mikla. In his book, American Plastic, A Cultural History, which focused on the meaning of plastics to what the author described as a civilization that seemed to be abandoning its ideals in pursuit of material goods. The acceptance of plastics from Mikla mirrored
It's not French.
I don't know what it is. Mirrored the growing materialism of modern society. They became a metaphor for it, as well as a material manifestation of it. Bakelite, this guy suggested, became synonymous with the modern streamlined style as the products it became linked with. Radios, for the most part, themselves became icons of modernity. Modern technology was made into a consumable form in the capable hands of far-sighted designers such as Peter Miller Monk and Paul T. Franklin. Muller-Monk is quoted as saying that plastics became almost the hallmark of modern design, the mysterious and attractive solution for almost any application requiring eye appeal, thereby anticipating Barth's observations in some years. By some years. See, it's important that I find out how to say it there, because I have to say it 4 more times in this page. Stupid. Designers, Meikle suggested, were responsible for imbuing plastics with their identity. Referring to aesthetic ideas of Walter Benjamin, he claimed, if there was in truth no uniform, Bakelite style, the stuff certainly projected a distinctive aura. Plastics were the ideal materials for mass production, and their progress through the 20th century was intrinsically linked to the idea of the democratized product to the extent that, after 1945, they lost their aura by being held responsible for the appearance of cheap, tacky objects fabricated in places such as Hong Kong. They had to be rescued and returned to the safe arena of high culture by a number of leading Italian designers in the 1950s and 60s. In the interwar years, however, as a material which housed radios, television sets and domestic appliances, plastics were not competing with more traditional materials and did not, therefore, constitute a threat to consumers. Even plastic jewellery found a place alongside more precious objects, and mundane household artefacts, such as hairbrushes, powder containers and ashtrays, acquired a level of acceptance through their symbolic links with modernity. Objects such as these served to reinforce middle-class women's newfound freedom in being able to indulge in the luxury of self-beautification in the comfort of their own homes. In their decorative applications, plastic objects, for the most part, emulated the forms of existing items, although the bright colours that could be achieved meant that the material inevitably brought its own look to those cheap artefacts. Where new products such as radios were concerned, however, there was plenty of room for innovation. A number of designers rose to the challenge, creating many exciting new forms which quickly became icons of modernity, and which are now considered to be classic objects of modern design. The aesthetically radical plastic radio cabinets designed by Serge Chemiflet and Wells Coates in Britain, for example, have become collectible items. The striking body shells created by these modernist architect designers performed the dual function of concealing the complex workings of the machines they encapsulated and, simultaneously, providing a powerful new visual imagery redolent of modernity. Given the strong cultural significance of the radio as part of the expanding interest in mass communications and their dramatic impact on the lives of modern British citizens in the 1930s, the symbolism of these objects was far-reaching and ensured plastics a high level of popular acceptance. The example of the radio demonstrates the way in which, with the exception of precious materials such as gold, which had an intrinsic monetary value attached to it, and others such as worn stone, which carry memories within them, materials is important, per se, to convey meanings without the helping hand of the designer, who can imbue them with significant form and imagery. Other classic designs of the interwar years included Raymond Loewy's famous reworking of the Gestener duplicating machine in 1934, the scale of which, given the technical limitations of casting plastic objects in moulds at that time, was exceptional. Inevitably, production technologies limited what designers could do, although casting, machining, laminating and rolling were all processes that could be applied to plastics. Moulding was by far the most frequently used. In the 1930s, the curves associated with the popular aesthetic known as streamlining became widespread, partly as a result of the fact that in its manufacture of plastic products, sharp corners were hard to extract from moulds. In addition, crown surfaces were used to compensate for the illusion that the surface of a plastic product was sinking inwards. It was the designer's role to provide a visible visual formulation for the artifacts made from these materials, based on their knowledge of the physical properties. In addition to what have become iconic plastic products of the era, countless new objects emerged from the factories of plastics manufactured in the USA and Europe in these years, from sewing machines and vacuum cleaners, we've already had this, to items of office equipment, all of them that owe their modern identities to developments in plastic technology and the designers who worked on them. In its early applications, aluminum was much less obviously a modern material for the public at large, in spite of the efforts made by many manufacturers to persuade consumers that it had the potential to be one. By the end of the 1930s, however, it had acquired a modern image for the application in aeroplane bodies, airships, tableware items, car bodies, and avant-garde furniture. Unlike plastics, however, even with the assistance of marketing and design, aluminium had to work hard to acquire an aura of modernity due to the fact that, in the form of cooking utensils, it stained in use and was thought to engender illness as a result. In an effort to refute the belief that it was a malevolent material, a number of manufacturers, including the Aluminium Reduction Company of Pittsburgh, invested large sums of money to promote the material to housewives. In an effort to sell their products, they organised department store demonstrations and advised on shop window displays. The most effective use of aluminium in these years was in early transport, especially aircraft, where its lightweight was a huge advantage. Though its utilisation in objects associated with the modern age, the material gradually began to acquire a contemporary aura. In the interwar years, designers such as Marcel Breuer and later the Dutchman Gerrit Rietveld experimented with it in their furniture designs, using it to replace steel, which was significantly heavier. Through its adoption by the American designer Russell Wright, it also entered the world of domesticity at this time. Aimed at the housewife, with her new image as a hostess, Wright's stylish spun aluminium tableware became highly desirable, welcomed into the home and onto the dining table. Following Wright's lead, and with the assistance of the designer Laurel Guild, the American company Aloka also moved into the production of household and small decorative items. Ultimately, however, it was as a material for the new objects of transportation that aluminium gained its most potent modern identity. For example, it appeared as let's read it right. For example, it appeared as the shiny fuselages of aircraft, which could defy gravity. In turn, aeroplanes became sources of inspiration for numerous other forms and objects created by designers who embraced the modern ethos. Other modern aluminium forms followed. For example, the classic aluminium chair, the Landing, created by the Swiss designer Hans Corey for the Swiss National Exhibition held in Zurich in 1938, acquired a high level of iconic significance, not just because of its physical lightness, but also, more significantly, as a result of its strong aesthetic relating to the idea of lightness, created by Corey's use of round holes punctured repeatedly into the metal. In the bodies of BMW's racing cars from the 1940s, the symbolism and function of aluminium were combined, and its light weight also gave the cars an advantage on the racetrack. By 1945, through the intervention of design, the light, shiny metal had become one of the most symbolically potent of all the materials of modernity. New materials played a crucial role in many of the modern design forms that emerged from the USA in the 1930s, and the imagery designers created for them was often strikingly innovative. As Donald Dochner, the designer employed by the Westinghouse Company, explained, imitating other materials may be an interesting technical stunt for some engineers, but it robs the new material of its bright light, destroys its identity and natural beauty, thereby degrading it. This strong commitment to the idea that new materials carry their own modern identity within them was echoed widely by many other designers who chose to work with them. Donald Deskey's interior work in Radio City Music Hall in New York has, for example, frequently been cited as an example of modern materials at their best. In his book, Depression Modern, the 30s Style in America, the writer Martin Grief provided a long list of synthetic substances used in his era, which included pyrrolin, fibrilloid, nixonide, tennite, amyroid, duarite, textilite, that's it, micarta, and interrock. Fucking stupid. Increasingly, consumers sought new materials in their everyday goods as a mark of their love affair with modernity. The 1933 Century of Progress exhibition held in Chicago, at which an all-aluminium Pullman coach was on display, was a shrine to new materials. The central theme was described as a dramatization of the achievements of mankind made possible through the application of science to industry, emphasizing its exclusively modern focus. The temporary buildings were made of plywood, light steel, asbestos, and gypsum board, and the section of the exhibition entitled Homes and Industrial Arts consisted of 8 model houses, each one fabricated in a different material, among them steel, masonite and glass. Chromed steel also took on modern significance in the interwar years. This application of a shiny, reflective surface on the base material appealed to the visually conscious consumers of modernity. Within modernism, the notion of artifice, seen as a marker of progressive, democratic and benevolent technology, came to be valued above nature, and the idea that technology could create its own objects, which in turn became the material manifestations of its own power and authority in the modern world, became widespread. At the same time, however, there was a limit to how far people would go to let technology enter into their homes, and chrome steel tube furniture only penetrated the most avant-garde of interiors, especially in Europe. The new materials, driven by large-scale American corporations, and were given forms by American designers who were happy to use their visual imaginations to this end. Progressive European architect designers were also experimenting with the applications of new materials, especially in the area of furniture design. Through the efforts of Marcel Breuer and Mies van der Rohe, Germany's achievements in tubular steel have been widely documented, as have those of French architect Le Corbusier. A discovery of the 19th century, and used because its combination of low weight and strength for the frames of bicycles suggested itself as a structural material for furniture design. In the hands of Breuer, Mies, Le Corbusier, and the Dutchman Maat Stam, among others, it facilitated the fundamental shift from the solid upholstered chair to a new skeletal structure that exploited the aesthetic possibilities of space rather than mass. In Finland, the architect Alvar Aalto produced furniture designs made from sheets of bent, laminated plywood, which could be made to perform a similar role to tubular steel in furniture design. Although not in itself a new material, through the utilization of new bending and bonding processes, wood could be made to work in new ways. Unlike their American equivalent, these experiments in new materials were led by designers and were less dependent, in the first instance, upon industrial manufacture. Quite quickly, however, the industrial significance of creating furniture with these materials was realized, and large-scale production was undertaken. Examples included the mass-produced tubular steel chairs of the British company Pell, Aalto's furniture manufactured by the Kohinen family firm in Finland, was imported into Britain in significant quantities in the 1930s by Finma. New materials were not technology's only contribution to the form and images of modern design. However, production engineers also played a key role in making new forms possible. In steel manufacturing, for example, the challenge was to create ever larger pieces of steel which could form product casings with a minimum amount of seams. The modern look was one which had left nature far behind, and which suggested that these new artifacts had fallen out of the sky. A seamless casing gave the impression of a kind of magic object, the product of science and technology seemingly untouched by human hand. Much effort went into the creation of an all-steel car body in this period. Early cars had been assemblages of components and materials put together with little regard for the visual effects of the end result. This gradually changed as steel bodies were developed, and the aesthetic of streamlining began to unify the car's form. The all-steel mass-manufactured automobile body eventually emerged in the USA in the 1910s. Oh, that's strange. 1910s. While the French company Citroën was the first to achieve the same result in Europe a little later. Efforts were also made to make the refrigerator appear as if it had been made from a single piece of steel, and developments took place in its manufacture to facilitate this. By the middle of the 1930s, the body of the refrigerator, with the exception of the door, was made from a single piece of steel. The inability at the time to bend steel with small radii, however, meant the fridges were characterized by dramatic modern forms which gave them pride of place in the kitchen and enhanced their role as primary status symbols, taking over from furniture which had performed the role since the mid-19th century. The interwar years saw a huge expansion in the new industries that focused on new goods such as automobiles and domestic appliances. While the producers struggled to use new materials to ease their costs and benefit from the properties that they offered, designers were given the responsibility for making the necessary symbolic connections with consumers. The manufacturers of more traditional goods, such as ceramics and glass, also sought to modernize their production techniques in these years, even if the end products frequently maintained a traditional appearance. The home also underwent a number of technological transformations, which helped merge it into a modern arena. Innovations in this sphere included the use of linoleum in the bathroom, laminated plastics on kitchen surfaces, the introduction of mass-produced furniture into the living room, the additional moulded glass and ceramic ornaments on the mantelpiece, aluminium pots and pans in the kitchen, and plastic-handled knives and forks on the dining table. Yay! They all represented an entry into modernity through consumption and an acknowledgement of the impact of technology and design in everyday life. This was especially apparent in the kitchen and the bathroom, where new technologies had an immediate impact. The world of fashion was also dramatically transformed by the advent of rayon, the new artificial silk, and a little later by that of nylon. The cultural impact of new materials, aided and abetted by design, was a highly significant contribution to the modernization of lives of large numbers of people in the interwar years. Both the materiality of the new way of life and the way in which these new seamless products were catapulted into everyday life, apparently untouched by human hand, provided consumers with a new set of experiences which were determined by culture rather than by nature, and which took humanity one step further away from the world it had inhabited before industrialization had changed things forever. Ah! Yeah! Fuck me. An hour